Hey there, everybody. Adam Francelli here. Want to go a little bit over what we call neutral pelvis. It's sort of a number of articles that I've spoken in and some videos that I've put out there, and a little bit of media has talked about when I refer to neutral pelvis. And so I know there's been some questions out there. So Hutch and Kev kind of asked me to talk a little bit about what exactly it is and how it's, very foundational for how we set up, how we move, and what the advantages of it are, not just from an anatomical point of view, but actual functionally, and how it can actually affect a tremendous amount both below and above the pelvis itself. So just to kind of start from scratch, neutral pelvis. So when we look at the pelvis from the side here, the structure of the pelvis, obviously it hinges, right? So we can rotate the pelvis, okay? Now, when we rotate the pelvis, there's two directions, right? We can rotate it what's called anteriorly. So anteriorly is this way, okay? Because we're actually tipping the pelvis in, even though a lot of people think it's kind of pushing it out. We're tipping the pelvis in here. Posterior is this way. So the way you can kind of remember is anterior pelvic tilt. If you had a set of headlights on your butt, if you were to anteriorly pelvic tilt, those headlights would shine up. If you have the same thing and you posteriorly pelvic tilt, those headlights would start to shine down. So anterior and posterior. Now, when I talk about a neutral pelvis, I also refer to a bit of a posterior pelvic tilt, because when we get into movement and functionally, we sort of need to think that way to be able to stabilize the pelvis, because if we don't actually think of an action, sometimes we'll naturally migrate into the faulty anterior rotation. Okay, so when I'm talking about setting up with a neutral pelvis, as I sink into my stance right away, so if I'm looking through traffic and all of a sudden, boom, I'm sinking into stance, you can see that I have a little bit of a round to the pelvis. Now, one thing I have to say right from the get-go is you can do too much of this, and I've seen guys do too much of this, and I've, in the past, have probably needed to be a little bit more on guys, because it's kind of that mentality of, if 5% is great, 50% is going to be even better, and it's not the case. So when I drop in, I'm talking about this. Now, I create kind of this nice round. What I'm not talking about from a posterior pelvic tilt point of view is this. Okay, I'll see guys who they're sitting in a chair, all right, and all of a sudden you've totally thrown your balance point off, your midline off. If you can see what I naturally did there was I end up having to put my hands in front of me as balance tools, because if I don't, I'm going to fall backwards and it puts me on my heels, right? And also it just creates too much tension through the whole system, and you're not being able to move freely. So please, I have to say from the outset, do not make that mistake. All right, so going back to it, posterior pelvic tilt. So I drop in, I'm here. Now what it does is it creates this nice curve, but also what we want to see is the curve that continues all the way up through lumbar, thoracic, and cervical spine, so it looks like a bit of a C, okay? Like this. But it's all done through the pelvis, all right? So in other words, instead of sinking in and being here with it, which I see a lot of people do, okay? So now the glutes are shot back. By the very nature of the movement, I have to extend. So because I'm creating extension in my lumbar spine, where you create extension in one part of your spine, you will naturally have a tendency to create extension in the rest of your spine. So if I create extension here, naturally, I'm going to create extension here. So now what have I done? I've pulled myself up and away from the puck. So now, especially if we're trying to track the puck, if I'm just all of a sudden creating extension here, but I know I have to look at the puck, and then all my flexion's done through my cervical spine, that's a very non-functional, non-effective way to track the puck. You want to be able to have the spine gently curved to support us looking at the puck, as opposed to a completely extended spine and then all the flexion done in the cervical spine, because it actually will still greatly disadvantage the rest of your body. So here we are. So we're looking like this, hands are in front. The nice thing about this is it puts me on the front of my skates, okay, so it puts me on my toes a little bit. It enables me to sink into my legs, right? And it allows me to have my hands nice and loose for save tools, not balance tools, and that's very important. I should be able to get into my stance and not have to use my arms to be able to stabilize myself. I can just have my hands free for making saves, okay? A couple other things here. Slight posterior pelvic tilt as opposed to anterior pelvic tilt. If I sit here and I start to move like this, what ends up happening is I've opened up my ilium. So I have my tailbone, okay, I have my sacrum and my ilium without getting into too heavy of anatomy here. So what I've ended up doing by sitting in here, I've opened this up, I've turned my glutes off. So think about what this lengthens. It lengthens my glutes and it lengthens my abdominal wall. Two of the very things we actually want to be able to move us properly. When I have a bit of a posterior pelvic tilt or neutral pelvis, my glutes turn on, my abdominal wall turns on, okay? Those are the things that it tightens. What does it lengthen? Well, it actually helps to lengthen and relieve the lumbar spine. So you see here, if I go into anterior, I really light up my lumbar spine, which is where a lot of guys complain of getting sore. Okay, so if I'm down here, it actually helps to soften a little bit of the lumbar spine, okay? It also creates more space in the hip flexors. So look at the hip flexor here when I go down into anterior tilt. If I go down like this, okay, look how jammed up the hip flexor is. Now, anything I do off of that, especially if I drop like this, it's gonna really light up those hip flexors. So I'm actually overactivating lumbar spine and hip flexor, okay? Glute and abdominal wall are turned off. Completely the opposite of what we want. Now look at the change when I change my tilt. So jammed up hip flexor, space in the hip flexor. If you can see my fingers here, okay, so two fingers sort of above and below where the hip flexor is or where you see it, okay, anterior pelvic tilt, my fingers are touching. Posterior pelvic tilt, look at the separation in my hip flexors. So now we've relieved our lumbar spine and our hip flexors. We've turned on our abdominal wall and our glutes. That's a good thing. So that saves our hips and it saves our back, okay? The only downside is you need a really strong set of legs, which you should have anyways. And if you don't have a strong set of legs, make your legs stronger. So think about this too. So now I've sort of closed off the ilium here a little bit. My glutes are on, I'm in my knees, I'm in my legs. I'm connected with the ice instead of being sort of away from the ice. What this also does is it actually loads a bit of a spring through my adductors. So this is the origin and the insertion point of the adductors, okay? There's more than one. So you gotta think, if I tilt my pelvis this way, I actually pull the origin point of my adductor away from the insertion point. Now that gives me a very poor mechanical advantage because there's sort of a tautness to those muscles that we don't want. If I keep my pelvis a little bit tucked or neutralized, what I end up doing is I end up sliding the origin point of the adductor towards the insertion point. Well, so now these muscles all of a sudden turn on and are activated as opposed to sort of turn off and are lengthened and more vulnerable. So you have that spring loaded. So what it does is, because the glutes are on, you're able to seal the ice so much quicker, right? So I'll show you from the front a little bit. So as I tilt a little bit, I've turned this on, I'm in my legs, and my inertia is going down and in. So if I'm patient, which we want to be, we're trying to be patient, we're trying to see that puck, we're trying to wait for the release before we go. What ends up happening is because my force is down and in and the spring's loaded, I automatically drive down and in because my glutes are on, they're going to assist me. The force of motion is already loaded for this wave. So if you see the glutes here, boom, 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 down, the glute slides and I'm down. So as opposed to too much anterior pelvic tilt, because we've shut this off, the femoral head, the head of the femur, is instead of being closed off and spring-loaded, what ends up doing is you get to here. Now my momentum is actually backwards. Okay, so the femoral head, just very, very momentarily, but it pushes back. So when I see guys and girls set up like this, and they're here, what ends up happening is because the hip flexors are jammed up, the femoral head, the inertia is already going backwards, they have to actually pull away and down. It's just a mechanism. So they end up going like this. They kind of end up going back and down sort of thing. Now I'm exaggerating, but it happens. So you end up becoming slow. Now, the other part of it too is if you have anterior pelvic tilt, it actually starts to open your legs up a little bit. So you're actually not set to seal. So instead of being down and together and quick and loaded, you're actually apart and away from it. Okay, now, so let's think about what that does, just from a pure goaltending point of view. So like I said before, we're trying to teach goaltenders to be patient. We're trying to get them to see the puck, move on to the puck, be patient, wait, read the release, wait for the release before they go. So think about just think about what incorrect pelvic angle does. So I'm going to show you again this way. So I'm reading a play, I'm out here. Now all of a sudden, I see this, I see the release happening. I'm going to be patient. Now, I decide to go. That moment, I get a slight reversing of the femoral head. I come back and then down. So what ends up happening is I get beat. And then I start to think, I'm going too soon. So then I start to cheat. And what ends up happening is, I always use the comparison, is it the rifle or is it the scope? If the rifle is bent or incorrect, and we start adjusting the scope to make up for the rifle, and because we think it's the scope, if we're making that read, and we're reading, and we get beat 5-hole, we're going to start thinking, my read's wrong, and I'm going too late, so I have to go early. So we start adjusting the scope when it's not the scope's fault at all. Then you start second guessing yourself because you are going too early, and then something else unfolds. So, this foundational principle is paramount to be able to help us make sure that everything's perfectly aligned. And goaltending is a position of perfection. Unlike any other position on the ice, it is a position of perfection. So the amount of detail, the amount of precision that we must have in our execution has to be spot on. And the pelvic angle makes a huge difference. So contrast that with being in here, my head's on the puck. And the other thing too is because it keeps the C shape to the spine, it actually helps the message from the eyes and the brain to the rest of the body move a little bit more harmoniously, because you're not creating, extension and all of a sudden you're creating flexion. It impedes the message a little bit. So if we're loaded here, we're loaded, I see it, everything is on to support me moving down or even across, then I make that read, I can go as late as I possibly can, and boom, the spring's loaded and I'm down, okay? So that's a drop in the bucket of the things I talk about when I talk about neutral pelvis. But, for the sake of not being completely overwhelming, I think that's at least a good start for understanding. Watch this, try to understand it, map it out yourself and really feel about what turns on versus what turns off. How's my head position? How does it change? Think about all those things and feel free to comment on the video, and perhaps we can get into a little bit more depth. There's a whole bunch of different things we can do that move off of just the stance set up in the foundation. But that is where we have to start. Our foundation predicates our stance, and that predicates all of our read, reaction, and stay selection that we use off of it. So I hope that helps unwind a little bit of the mystery. And like I said again, let's see how that goes, and perhaps we can add on to this in the future. But use the information. Good luck. We'll see you soon.